tell you the desperation the government is working in. Most of these young people are under the age of 25. 18-year-old young people being charged with terrorism in circumstances which, when you consider, you can't see any terrorist act that's going to be proved. What is being done is to just create terror for the young people, create terror for the families, and control. But this is not going to be allowed.
In the heart of East Africa, where the legacy of Jomo Kenyatta and the spirit of Uhuru once promised liberation from colonial chains, a new generation stands at the precipice of history. On July 16, 2025, at the Kahawa Law Courts, former Chief Justice David Maraga delivered words that should send tremors through the corridors of power, not just in Nairobi, but across the African continent. 8 young Kenyans, their ages barely touching 21, stood accused under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, not for wielding weapons or orchestrating violence, but for the audacity to demand accountability from their government. This is not merely a Kenyan story, it is the story of a continent where the descendants of those who fought colonial oppression now face the cruel irony of being terrorized by systems that bear their own flag. The scene at Kahawa Law Courts was emblematic of a broader continental struggle, as Maraga spoke of weaponizing the criminal justice system to terrorize arrested youth. His words echoed the warnings of Kwame Nkrumah about neo-colonialism's many faces. Here was Kenya's former Chief Justice, a man who had once sworn to uphold the Constitution, now compelled to defend the very democracy he had served. The irony was not lost on those present. The institutions built to protect the people were being wielded against them, particularly against the youth who dared to envision a Kenya free from the shackles of corruption and impunity. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just the charges themselves, but the generational divide they represent. These are not the children of Kenya's independence generation. They are the digital natives, the ones who have watched their elders' dreams of post-colonial prosperity wither under the weight of systemic corruption. They are Generation Z, globally connected, historically informed, and unafraid to challenge the very foundations of power that have failed them. Their arrests under terrorism charges represent more than judicial overreach. They symbolize the desperate attempts of a failing system to silence the voices of transformation. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must traverse the historical landscape that shaped modern Kenya. The journey from colonial subjugation to independence was paved with the blood and sacrifice of freedom fighters who understood that true liberation required more than ceremonial flag changes. The Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, led by figures like Dedan Kimathi and Field Marshal Muthoni, demonstrated that Africans would not accept foreign domination indefinitely. These heroes faced colonial terrorism laws remarkably similar to those being wielded against today's youth protesters. The colonial administration's use of emergency powers and detention without trial created a blueprint that, tragically, has been adopted by successive post-independence governments. The emergency regulations of 1952 allowed for arbitrary detention, just as the Prevention of Terrorism Act now permits the state to classify dissent as terrorism. The parallel is not coincidental. It represents the persistence of colonial methodologies within supposedly independent African institutions. Jomo Kenyatta's ascension to power in 1963 carried the promise of breaking these chains. His philosophy of Harambee, collective responsibility and self-reliance, envisioned a Kenya where the people would be the architects of their own destiny. Yet even during his tenure, the seeds of authoritarianism were planted. The transition from Daniel Arap Moi's 24-year rule to the multi-party era under Mwai Kibaki and later Uhuru Kenyatta represented attempts to democratize power, but the underlying structures of control remained largely intact. The 2010 Constitution, championed by civil society and progressive leaders, was supposed to be Kenya's second liberation. It promised judicial independence, devolution of power, and protection of fundamental rights. The irony that these very constitutional provisions are now being subverted to terrorize young protesters reveals the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with leaders who view power as personal property rather than public trust. Throughout Kenya's post-independence journey, the youth have consistently been the vanguard of progressive change. From the university students who challenged Moi's authoritarianism in the 1980s to the young activists who mobilized for constitutional reform in the 2000s, each generation has faced state repression. The current Generation Z movement represents the culmination of this historical trajectory, a generation that refuses to accept the normalized corruption and impunity that their predecessors endured. The economic context cannot be ignored. Kenya's youth unemployment rate exceeds 40%, while corruption scandals involving billions of shillings regularly surface without meaningful accountability. The Goldenberg and Anglo leasing scandals of previous decades have given way to newer forms of systematic looting, leaving young Kenyans with limited economic opportunities despite their education and aspirations. This economic disenfranchisement provides the material basis for their political awakening. The charges brought against the 8 young protesters under the Prevention of Terrorism Act represent a fundamental perversion of anti-terrorism legislation. Originally designed to combat genuine threats to national security, these laws have been weaponized to criminalize legitimate political dissent. Former Chief Justice Maraga's characterization of these as trumped-up charges, supported by a defective charge sheet, exposes the judicial system's complicity in this authoritarian drift. The sophistication of modern state repression lies not in its brutality alone, but in its ability to cloak authoritarianism in legal language. By invoking terrorism charges, the Ruto administration attempts to delegitimize the protesters' cause while simultaneously justifying extraordinary measures against them. This tactic mirrors strategies employed by authoritarian regimes across the continent, from Egypt's use of terrorism laws against political opponents to Nigeria's deployment of similar legislation against separatist movements. The Anti-Terrorism Police Unit, ATPU, mentioned by Maraga, represents the institutionalization of repression. Created ostensibly to combat terrorism, such units often become instruments of political control. The involvement of ATPU in cases involving peaceful protesters demonstrates how security apparatus designed for external threats can be redirected against internal dissent. This transformation of security institutions from protectors of the people to guardians of regime survival is a hallmark of authoritarian consolidation. The economic dimensions of this repression cannot be overlooked. The bail amount of 50,000 shillings for each protester, while seemingly modest, represents a significant financial burden for young people from ordinary backgrounds. Kirinyaga woman, Representative Njeri Maina's plea for consideration of the accused's economic circumstances highlights how the justice system can become a tool of class warfare. When justice becomes a commodity available only to those who can afford it, the constitutional promise of equality before the law becomes a cruel mockery. The timing of these arrests, coinciding with the Gen Z anniversary protests on June 25th, reveals the state's fear of organized youth mobilization. The anniversary protests represented more than commemoration. They demonstrated the sustainability of the movement and its ability to maintain momentum despite state repression. The arrests were clearly intended to disrupt this organizational capacity and deter future mobilization. The response of legal professionals like Maraga and Maina represents a crucial element in resisting authoritarian encroachment. Their willingness to challenge the legality of these charges demonstrates the importance of institutional independence in defending democratic values. However, their very need to speak out also reveals the extent to which democratic institutions have been compromised. The international implications of Kenya's authoritarian drift extend beyond its borders. As a regional hub and diplomatic center, Kenya's democratic regression affects stability throughout East Africa. The country's role in regional organizations like the East African Community and the African Union means that its internal crisis of governance has continental consequences. International partners, who have long viewed Kenya as a beacon of stability in the region, must now confront the reality of its democratic decline. The use of terrorism charges against protesters also represents a violation of international human rights standards. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which Kenya has ratified, guarantees freedom of assembly and expression. The arbitrary detention of protesters violates these commitments and undermines Kenya's credibility in international forums. The generational aspect of this repression deserves particular attention. The targeting of young protesters reflects the state's recognition that Kenya's youth represent the greatest threat to the status quo. Unlike previous generations, who may have been co-opted through patronage systems, Generation Z has demonstrated remarkable resistance to traditional forms of political manipulation. Their digital nativity has enabled them to organize beyond the reach of conventional state surveillance, making them particularly dangerous to authoritarian consolidation. The protesters' demands for accountability and transparency represent fundamental challenges to the systems of corruption that have defined Kenyan governance for decades. Their refusal to accept normalized impunity threatens the entire edifice of patronage politics that has sustained the political elite. This explains the disproportionate response to their peaceful protests. They represent an existential threat to the current system of governance. The crisis unfolding in Kenya cannot be understood in isolation from broader continental trends toward authoritarian consolidation. Across Africa, governments are increasingly resorting to repressive measures to contain growing youth activism and demands for democratic accountability. The Kenyan case provides a troubling template that other regimes may seek to emulate, while also offering lessons for resistance movements across the continent. The regional implications are particularly significant given Kenya's role as a diplomatic and economic hub in East Africa. The country hosts numerous international organizations, including the United Nations Environment Program and various regional bodies. Its democratic regression undermines its credibility as a mediator in regional conflicts and threatens its position as a beacon of stability in a volatile region. The international community's response to Kenya's crisis will signal whether democratic regression will be tolerated or challenged. The economic ramifications extend beyond Kenya's borders through regional integration mechanisms. The East African community's vision of deeper economic integration assumes democratic governance and rule of law among member states. Kenya's authoritarian drift threatens this integration agenda and may encourage similar tendencies in neighboring countries. The common market protocols that facilitate trade and investment are predicated on legal predictability and respect for property rights, both of which are undermined by arbitrary state action. The youth dimension of this crisis resonates across Africa, where demographic trends show that the majority of the population is under 30. The strategies employed by the Kenyan government to suppress youth activism provide a playbook for other regimes facing similar challenges. However, the resilience and adaptability of Kenyan youth also offer inspiration for young people across the continent who are confronting their own authoritarian governments. The role of technology in both enabling protest organization and facilitating state surveillance represents a continental challenge. Kenya's experience with internet shutdowns and social media monitoring during protests mirrors tactics employed from Nigeria to Zimbabwe. The battle for digital rights has become integral to the broader struggle for democratic governance, with implications for freedom of expression and assembly across the continent. The international dimension of Kenya's crisis involves not just Western donors, but also emerging powers with interests in Africa. China's growing influence in Kenya through infrastructure investments and loans creates additional complexity in addressing governance challenges. The Chinese model of development without democracy may provide alternative legitimacy for authoritarian tendencies, complicating international efforts to promote democratic governance. The African Union's response to Kenya's crisis will test the organization's commitment to democratic governance principles. The AU's peer review mechanisms and democratic governance initiatives are designed to address such situations, but their effectiveness depends on political will among member states. Kenya's importance to continental diplomacy may shield it from serious scrutiny, highlighting the limitations of regional governance mechanisms. The cultural dimensions of Kenya's youth uprising reveal deeper currents of change that transcend immediate political grievances. Generation Z's resistance represents not just a rejection of corruption and impunity, but a fundamental challenge to the cultural norms that have sustained authoritarian governance. Their digital nativity has created new forms of political consciousness that bypass traditional gatekeepers of information and opinion. The linguistic choices of these young protesters, their use of social media platforms, memes, and digital organizing tools represent a cultural revolution that parallels their political activism. They have created new vocabularies of resistance that resonate across ethnic and class lines, challenging the divisive politics that have long characterized Kenyan governance. Their ability to mobilize across traditional boundaries demonstrates the emergence of a truly national consciousness among Kenya's youth. The intergenerational tensions revealed by this crisis reflect broader cultural shifts in African societies. The respect for authority that characterized previous generations is being challenged by young people who demand accountability and transparency. This represents a fundamental shift in political culture, with implications that extend far beyond immediate policy debates. The role of education in shaping this generation's political consciousness cannot be overlooked. Unlike previous generations, who may have had limited access to information, Generation Z has grown up with unprecedented access to global knowledge and communication networks. This has created a generation that is historically informed, globally connected, and unafraid to challenge established authority. The events at Kahawa Law Courts represent more than a single moment of crisis. They symbolize the broader struggle for Africa's democratic future, the courage of former Chief Justice Maraga in speaking truth to power, the determination of young protesters to continue their struggle despite state repression, and the solidarity of legal professionals in defending constitutional principles all point toward the possibility of democratic renewal. The international community must recognize that Kenya's crisis is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of democratic regression across Africa. Supporting Kenya's youth movement requires more than symbolic gestures. It demands concrete action to isolate authoritarian tendencies and support democratic institutions. This includes targeted sanctions against officials responsible for human rights violations, support for civil society organizations, and diplomatic pressure for genuine democratic reform. The lessons from Kenya's experience must inform broader strategies for defending democracy across Africa. The weaponization of terrorism laws against peaceful protesters represents a continental challenge that requires coordinated response. Regional organizations like the African Union must develop more effective mechanisms for addressing democratic regression before it becomes entrenched. The economic dimensions of democratic governance cannot be ignored. Young Africans' demands for accountability are fundamentally about creating economic opportunities and ensuring that public resources serve public purposes. Addressing youth unemployment and creating pathways for economic participation are essential components of any sustainable democratic settlement. The role of technology in enabling both state repression and citizen mobilization requires careful attention. Protecting digital rights and ensuring access to information are now central to the struggle for democratic governance. International support for digital rights organizations and investment in secure communication technologies can help level the playing field between authoritarian states and civil society. This moment demands our engagement, our support, and our unwavering commitment to the principles of justice and human dignity. If this analysis has resonated with you, I urge you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these crucial stories of African resistance and renewal. Click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content, and share this video with others who care about Africa's democratic future. Together, we can amplify the voices of those fighting for justice and ensure that their struggles are not forgotten. The youth of Kenya have shown us that the spirit of resistance lives on. Now it's our turn to support them in their just cause. Like, subscribe, and let's build a community committed to African sovereignty and democratic governance.